We've made it. We're here. Second Nature Podcast. Corrine Malcolm, episode number 70. This is actually the first time we've talked to each other, even though we've been basically in like the same circle for years. I'm really excited about this, and I kind of pitched this to you as like the past, present, and future of Corrine, because I think the story that we have to tell today is really just fascinating because you've been an athlete, you've been a media personality, you've got a really exciting future ahead, and you've kind of woven it all together. We could honestly start just about anywhere in this story and kind of go from there.
Yeah, I
But
have to put you on a heater a little bit because I think I first heard your name when you were the athlete manager at Red Bull, and we had some really good mutual friends like Paris Gore, who's an amazing photographer
yeah,
out of Bellingham, Washington. My husband was a mountain biker, so we kind of like worked in parallel circles, or the Venn diagrams almost Venn diagrammed a few times. And my husband was like, "You got to give Aaron a ton of crap for never getting you that Red Bull hat." And I was like, "I know, I've got to be like." I was pitching the Red Bull athlete life for a very long time.
that would have been an epic signing, to be honest. And we got Dylan in there, which was a huge win. We built as much as we possibly could together. But yeah, it would have been that would have been a pretty epic signing. Actually, that would have been super fun to get a chance to work together. And I'm sorry.
Okay, our paths have diverged in the woods, and that is totally fine.
Yeah, but now they're coming back together. We've got this podcast, and we're going to talk all about everything there is to talk about related to sponsorship, related to the industry, related to media. And I guess like one of the things that I want to start with, and we can move from here, but we're both podcasters. You've been doing it a bit longer than I have, but I'd love to know from your perspective, what has it been like interacting with the world with a podcast? Because people spend hours with you every single week listening to Trail Society on Free Trail, but then you get to go to these events and interact with people as well as an athlete, as a media personality. What's that experience been like for you?
I mean, it's definitely a parasocial relationship, right? And sometimes it's like very fun, and I've gotten more used to it. And sometimes it's like, whoa, like you know a lot about me because I'm a public person and I put a lot out there, but I know nothing about you, type of thing. So the relationship is accidentally, but also I think for a lot of people intentionally, very one-sided. And so all of a sudden you're in the wild and people recognize you, or they recognize your voice, or they've spent hours listening to you. I've got friends who will be like, when I miss you, I just put the podcast on and I like clean the kitchen. It's great. But it is kind of always one of those things where you're going to meet people who are fans, or just have spent a lot of time, aggregated hours and hours and hours, um, listening to what you have to say and your opinions and following your own journey. Because the podcast for me has been this like talking about science, talking about the sport, talking about other people, but also talking about my own personal experience as an athlete, as a female athlete. Um, and so that connects you very quickly with people. I've also had moments though, like I was at a race in South Africa last year, or 2023. It's just the beginning of 2025, so I'm never sure what year it is anymore. But I was in South Africa for UTCT, and I got lost, and I was kind of having a rough day, and I ended up running with these two women who both happened to be fans of the podcast,
That's
and it was super cool, and they were jazzed, and their energy was amazing. And all I wanted to be able to do at one point was just like complain about how hard of a day I was having, but they were both having amazing days. And I was like, man, I can't like be out here like complaining about having this like horrible day, because these two women are having awesome, awesome days. So I just had to like keep my mouth shut and like enjoy the experience and like try to take their positivity with me. But like as an anonymous person, it would have been great just to complain about like what a horrible experience I was having. And instead I was like, oh, you're a fan of the pod, like thank you for making sure I'm okay, like your race is going really well, how can I help you now? So it can be kind of a roller coaster of like, it's just a different experience. You're no longer anonymous in a big way.
Well, I mean, you were not anonymous before the podcast. You're a legendary ultra racer, and I've got to wonder, was there like an inflection point for you going from being pro athlete and going to races, showing up, being someone that everybody knew, but they maybe hadn't heard you talk before, and then you layer on the podcasting where people are starting to spend more time with you. Did it change for you? Did it feel different as you kind of made as you added that into the mix?
I mean, I think if the like we hadn't had like a COVID pandemic, right? Like that was such an inflection point for everyone, and that's kind of where a lot of this started, was kind of in that 2019, 2020 time frame going into 2021. And so there were a lot of like inflections that happened at that point. Like we had the pandemic that shut everything down. So we weren't racing, we weren't traveling to do that kind of stuff, we weren't meeting in person. I, during that time period, ran a huge FKT, and then like 4 months later injured myself horribly. And so I actually spent most of 2021 like laid up with injury. And that's when we started doing more live broadcasts. That's where the podcast really kicked off, and picked up in a big way. And so for me, it was like the inflection point was just actually like my relationship changing with the sport. And instead of like me wanting to be like closeted off or like avoid the sport at all cost, to me it was like, no, this is my community, I want to be here, I want to be present, I want to be involved. And so instead of hiding during a time where I had stress fractured my pelvis and like could not run, I went all in and got to do the first ever Western States live broadcast with our good friend Dylan Bowman. um, all of a sudden was putting out a podcast that was doing well and celebrated by women in the sport. And so instead of running away during a time where I wasn't actually doing a lot of running, I got to like embrace it all a bit more. And so that that changed my relationship with the sport probably more than the podcast, more than live broadcasting,
Hmm.
but they all happened at the same time.
I got to ask you about Western States because 30 hours of talking just nonstop, keeping it interesting, keeping people engaged, that is, it's got to be like a world record, right? Like longest live stream sports event. I don't know, right? Like that's, I mean, it's up there if it's not a record,
It's up
but
there. I mean, there are longer, it turns out, like Cocodona 250, they technically run a broadcast for it. They do have teams changing out. And at Western States, we also like do get to tag out kind of in the middle of the night to go sleep. Dylan goes to sleep and doesn't come back. I go to sleep and then I come back and do Golden Hour with Topher Gaylord and Billy Yang, which is just a treat every single year. We're like always in absolute tears. One, because we haven't slept at all, and two, because like the golden hour of a 100-mile race is an incredibly emotional experience, witnessing it in person or otherwise. And
is the
so
golden hour the last hour?
it's the
Like
final
that's the
hour.
cutoff, right? Okay.
And you have, I mean, during a race like Western States that finishes on a track at a high school, you'll have 5, 6 people on the track at a time finishing every minute for like that last hour. So it's kind of a mad rush to the finish, to the final official finisher, to the person who just misses the cutoff as well. We're there for all of it. Um, but yeah, it turns out Dylan and I make a really good team, and we're both just like very good at talking. And so the two of us together, I joke that he is ESPN and I am NPR. And together we like form this like perfect pair of like stoke from Dylan generally. And then me being like, but the data, let's talk about the data. And so we come together in a symbiotic way.
Was it like that from the jump though? When you first got involved with it, with that first live stream, did you always have that like immediate? I mean, you guys obviously knew each other and everything, but how long did it take to kind of gel into that?
I think we got really lucky that it was like pretty instantaneous. I think we had to learn a little bit about like each other's like how we could like cue each other a little bit, or like what was a break versus what was a breath, and like how did we fill space together. But I feel fortunate that it didn't take a lot of work, that it just kind of happened very naturally, and that we both excelled in that space together. Kind of took roles very naturally, and we've gotten to the point now too where, initially Dylan took, every single kind of sign off, sign on, commercials, whatever. We also recognized very quickly that like I am very good at multitasking, like love Dylan to death, but the boy has to focus on like one task at a time. And so if there are messages coming through from like production, from behind the scenes, from Harmony, from the Gaylords on course, from the tech team, I'm the one who sees that. I'm the one who can like both talk and monitor the chat on YouTube at the same time and like address things that are going on there. And so what we recognized was that my ability to like very, very rapidly multitask to bring those pieces all together paired really well with like his natural skill sets of making sure that we like talked about the sponsors and like had an appropriate sign off at the end of the day or before we went to commercial break. And so we found our roles very quickly, and it's nice that they're complementary and that it's not like us stepping on each other at all.
That's so cool. Yeah, it takes a little time to get to that point, but when you've got a 30-hour broadcast, you got a little extra time to get those reps in. I think I'm just now getting to that point with him, and we're 70 episodes in. So it's not an immediate skill. You can't learn that anywhere other than to just do it, in my experience. The question I'd love to ask you about too is like during that time, you're also a pro athlete, and you did have an injury during part of that time, but I'm curious about sort of the mixture of everything that you did as you were kind of going through this whole process. So you were an athlete, you were a coach, you offer coaching to other runners, and then you're also building out this sort of like media side of things with the podcast and the live stream. Could you give us like a little insight into how you were thinking about this? Like how much of this was sort of premeditated of like, I'm going to add this thing and I'm going to add this thing versus just stuff falling in your lap?
I mean, I think a lot of it's kind of accidental, and it's not like it's not luck, I would say. Like, yeah, there's a degree of like right time, right place, but it's also just like years of kind of putting yourself out there. It is a weird balancing act, like trying to run 100-mile race in the middle of July, a couple weeks after Western States, when like the Broken Arrow to Western States double from a media perspective is like very, very exhausting. Um, I think I managed to put in a 100-mile week at Western States 2 years ago.
Wow.
But I also like needed to triple some days because I couldn't get a 20-mile run in. So it's like I would wake up early and I'd go for a run, and then Dylan and I would have 2 hours worth of interviews. And then we'd have like a meeting, and then we'd have another 2 hours worth of interviews, and then I'd get in a shakeout run, and then I'd like do another run before dinner to try to like piecemeal together a 20-mile day type of thing. That's not advisable. It's like
Not
not
ideal.
great. Dylan figured it out much quicker than I did, where it was like, oh, if I do like an exhausting activity in early June and then like again in early August, and so I go into Western States or UTMB week like tired and ready to sit there and like just talk about running, is probably a much smarter strategy than being like, my goal 100-mile race is 3 weeks after Western States. Like that is bad. It's not ideal. So it's taken some learning because I didn't give up one thing to do something else. I've joked with a lot of people that my career in general and being like a 30 something year old has been about like flailing forward. Like I knew that I was moving in a direction, but many days feel like you have no idea why you're doing what you're doing or how it's going to become something more tangible down the road, but you just kind of keep putting your head down and getting it in, um, by doing weird doubles and triples and like just making the miles work. But it's yeah, it's partly by accident. Like there's things that I wanted to do, and I don't have a great understanding of my limitations. Like I've always been a person who thrives best a little overextended. Like as a high school student, my mom was like, Corinne goes to school for the extracurriculars. She could like care less about the school part, but she's gonna like run cross country and go to the state meet while also like going from cross country practice to like high school musical theater practice so that she can be part of like the fall musical or whatever it is. So I like to be a little overextended, it turns out. And so, yeah, having six, quote unquote odd jobs just all of a sudden makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
It's that's what keeps it interesting, that's for sure. I,
Yeah.
I want to hear a little bit more about the coaching side of things, and maybe this fits in somehow with before you started the podcast, before you started doing live streams, you were just focused on being a pro athlete, and then I've got to assume that the coaching came in around that time so that you could just focus in on that specifically. Am I right? Is that sort of how it came together, where it was like, this is this is going to make up the program for now,
This makes
and
the most sense. Yeah.
I'm gonna fit these together, and this is how I'm gonna pay rent? Or
So like yes and no, I guess. So I come from the biathlon and cross country ski world. Like did that, like was a cross country skier in college. And when I was looking to go to grad school up in Vancouver, BC, I had like stopped skiing and had just stopped coaching juniors for skiing. I helped get like a junior biathlon program off the ground in Bozeman, Montana, which is now the very successful Crosscut Mountain Sports Center there. Um, moved to Vancouver to go to grad school, was incredibly poor, but was like trail running more and like doing that kind of thing, and recognized that like in order to pay rent in Vancouver, like just TAing as a grad student wasn't going to cut it. And I was like, I need a flexible remote job. Like, how am I going to figure this out? CTS happened to be hiring. And so I actually coached with Jason Coop for CTS for 6 years. They hired me as a grad student. I was part of their second cohort of coaches they ever hired, and wasn't running professionally yet at the time. Actually, hadn't done my first ultra yet. Was like working on training for my first ultra while I was like being onboarded and trained as a coach there. My background is in exercise physiology. Studied in undergrad. I was going to grad school for environmental physiology, so studying heat and altitude in a climactic chamber primarily. Worked at Lululemon on some research projects while I was up there for my like my co-residents, my cohort mates, their master's thesis projects. But was still very broke, and so took to coaching with CTS in order to pay for rent in one of the most expensive cities in North America. And it was a great combination of the things that I loved, working with athletes, which I had done already, the science that I thought was fascinating and was continuing to study. And then I was getting more and more involved and engaged in trail running and ultra running. And the pieces like kind of like just all fell together. So I was actually hired at the same time as AJW and Adam St. Pierre and myself. They had John Fitzgerald was already working for the company. So it was this interesting mixture of like AJW who had no physiology experience, but was a legend in trail and ultra running. And then me, this like shithead grad student who like knew about sports, but like wasn't an ultra runner, kind of all under one roof, learning together. And so, yeah, they brought me up as a coach and got more and more invested and involved in ultra running and trail running, and signed my first quote unquote like professional contract in 2018, and then signed with Adidas Terex, who I ran for the last 6 years in 2019. And so just like threw myself all in, like, why couldn't I go to grad school? Why couldn't I be a coach? Why couldn't I be a trail and ultra athlete? Why couldn't I run 100 miles? Like ran Leadville in 2017 because I was like, if I go longer, maybe I'll be better at this thing. And so I kind of go all in very quickly, but at the same time like have to have a lot of balls in the air.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I read something recently. They were talking about the four different kinds of luck. And one of the kinds of luck is motion, where you sort of raise your hand, you're already doing the thing, and it kind of builds on top of that. And it's easy to look backwards at this stuff and say, like, oh, well, she was coaching and she became a pro athlete. And then obviously all of her accolades got her more coaching clients. What a genius way to put it all together. But it seemed like you had thrown a lot of darts at the board, and then they just kind of connected and started building, and that opened the door to the next thing and the next thing, which kind of ties into that idea of things in motion, right?
Yeah, definitely the the laws of physics as well, like an object in motion stays in motion. That's
Yeah.
definitely, I would say, how our household survives.
I find that the more often you raise your hand for stuff and you just put yourself forward, it just something usually comes from it, right? And maybe not what you expect. And sometimes it's not an immediate thing, it's sort of indirect, right? It's like two or three permutations down the line where you actually get to something that's even more interesting than what you originally thought, which sort of seems like kind of how things have played out. You started as coach, athlete, developed that out, got, tapped to create more content. That went well. You got tapped to create even more content. And the stuff that you've learned along the way will be extremely useful kind of moving forward.
Yeah, like during that time, I again like can just continue to raise my hand. I was like, I love science. I love science writing. If I've learned anything in grad school, like that's what I really like is just like science communication. So I wrote a column for I Run Far, kind of starting in grad school and continuing on for many years, called Running on Science. We put out a monthly science piece there. I took on the running portion of the CTS podcast, the Train Rate podcast, while they were running that. So Adam Pulford was my like bike co-host essentially. So he ran the biking side of it, I ran the running side of it, which was really fun. So it's just like there's been iterations of this thing that have continued to build over time that now leads me to this, again, still a weird combination of work that somehow equates into a living that I put together every calendar year.
It's working, and it's really inspiring. I want to talk a little bit more about Trail Society because I feel like one of the main themes with that podcast too is also, kind of science based, right? Can you talk just a little bit more? There's probably a handful of people listening to the pod that aren't familiar with what you do there.
Yeah, so I co-host a podcast with Keely Henninger and Hillary Allen, two other professional trail athletes who both are giant science nerds. Keely worked for Nike for a very long time in their wearables lab, helping to design app algorithms, and then worked in their movement science lab as well before now going to medical school. Hillary Allen's got a master's degree in neuroscience and really focused on like the biochemistry side of things. And so we're just three huge nerds who also happen to be professional female trail runners. And we all separately had been like working or talking to Dylan about ideas and projects. I was like co-hosting random podcasts with Dylan to talk about like state of the sport. Keely was working on some content as they were building out then Pillars, now Free Trail, working on some women's specific kind of items for them from the science lens. And then Hillary's just like everyone's friend. So she was there. And we all had pitched Dylan, I think, at that point in time, like on a podcast. We're like, hey, we love what you're doing, but the last thing we need is like another podcast hosted by a couple dudes. Why don't we? Why don't we or why don't I host a podcast? And so Dylan was like, hey, why don't the three of you talk? Because it sounds like you all want to host a podcast. And so we came together as three individuals to co-host a podcast. It's evolved and stayed the same in a lot of ways. We generally talk about kind of state of the sport, but not just state of women's trail running, but kind of state of women's sports in general. We actually got to interview the CEO of Parity Now recently, which was super cool because Leela had just put out a big research project with a bunch of professional athletes kind of looking at pay and like the kind of the equity gap there with women's pay in professional sports. So we talk a lot about women's sport in general. We're soccer fans, we're tennis fans, we're fans of the PHL, et cetera, PWHL. So we wanted to like highlight all of that, talk about Olympic sport, talk about cycling. So while we are a trail podcast, technically, we do like always do like a news and science section where we come out every other week and we talk about something that we've seen recently, right? We're big followers of the Gist and Together and these other entities that are kind of creating more and more hype and putting out more media content around women's sports. So kind of summarizing that for the running audience and the trail audience. And then we'll oftentimes just like connect on what we've been doing. Most recently, talk about an interesting bit of research that's come out, interview experts in the field, people like Emily Krause, who helps to run the FASTER program at Stanford. We're actually going to interview a postdoc and a PhD student that's working with FASTER in a couple of weeks that we're really excited about. So we interview these like kind of experts in their fields. Shalala Kipp on sports bra research that she's doing. She's now a researcher at Mayo, but also athlete interviews after big events. So had Hannah Allgood on recently after Javelina to talk about, getting a golden ticket, just more about her kind of experience in general and her goals for the year. So try to cover a lot of bases, but it really at the end of the day is like three women talking sports, talking about women in trail running, and then trying to touch on as much science as possible because on topics in particular that aren't often covered well or covered robustly. So relative energy deficiency in sport, menstrual irregularity. People are going to be like, these are all the catchphrases I normally come to Second Nature for, obviously. But talking about that, we did a whole series talking to mothers, either who are like currently pregnant or were postpartum and returning to running, talk to pelvic floor PTs and specialists. So trying to like incorporate topics that aren't given a lot of light, but then also just kind of like things that are currently going on in the science that impact more than just women as well.
Very cool. That's so interesting. And I think that's always one of the things too, is that all this data and research and information when it comes to the health stuff, it's like a lot of it is super biased towards men. And so it's not really, in some cases, even applicable when it comes to women, especially in sport. And so to have that other side of it being represented in a really deep and meaningful way by people who know what they're talking about is a pretty important element to the sport. I mean, there are a lot of women in the sport of trail running specifically that have got to be just really getting a lot out of those discussions for sure.
Yeah,
What is
I hope so.
you've had a chance and you've been talking about, kind of where everything is headed and the state of the sport and everything. Obviously the women in trail running had an absolutely massive year in 2024 and throughout other sports. We referenced a study on the pod a handful of times called the fame gap, and it was basically how like singular female athletes are just like raising entire sports on their own, which is really fascinating, and it digs into a little bit more of the other gaps that exist. And I'll make sure that one shows up in the show notes because I find that one very interesting. But I'd be really curious to hear from you, kind of what your thought is for the year ahead. What can we expect other than, I'm sure, even more game changing performances at events, but what else is out there? What should we be paying attention to in 2025?
Yeah, I think it's cool because you think of like Courtney Dauwalter and Katie Scheid as like our women that are elevating the whole sport in general, who have made it mainstream in big ways. Um, yeah, I think it's one of those interesting scenarios where we're seeing the sport accelerate broadly, right, across the board, men and women, but we're seeing the women's professional side accelerate even more rapidly, let's say. And that's also indicated in road running, right? Where women weren't allowed to run the marathon for the longest time. Therefore, once women were allowed to run the road marathon, the time it took for enough women to be in the sport to actually advance it took a second. And so there was kind of this like secondary boost in women's road running in which like times all of a sudden rapidly improved. We're seeing that same thing happen in trail running where we've got more professional women, more women in the sport in general, more professional women in the sport, more sponsorship dollars going towards women, people making careers out of it. Just kind of continues to like improve that, I would say, like wider rise of women in the space. But I do think we're going to continue to see more concerted efforts. There's been a lot of things where it's like we talk about how do we get more women into trail running? How do we get more women into ultra running? And we've got to stop talking about it. We've actually got to like do things to bring more women into the sport. And I think we're going to see race entities and companies invest a lot more in that in 2025.
Yeah. You had mentioned before the pod about the start at Unbound, where they had the women's start, and how important that actually was for the race itself to have them go out first. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the time that I was yelling at the trees super loudly.
You're not alone. A lot of people do that when they listen to our podcast, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's the right kind of rage. You know that I care about you and your podcast if I like live text you as I'm listening to it. Finn Melanson's in that group. David Roach periodically gets texts from me where I'm like, "Excuse me, I have a clarifying point that was missed in this." But it's yes. So we were talking about how you guys were highlighting Unbound, amazing. Heather Jackson's performance there, talking about her doubling back to Western states. How cool is that going to be? But in part it was because there was a bunch sprint at the finish of
Yeah.
the biggest gravel race in gravel cycling. Really cool to see, right? That's an elevation in the women's peloton. That's an elevation in their performances. Allowing those separate starts also means that like the coverage is better for both races because we're not trying to find the women in the field.
Yeah.
It means that we can like learn about them, learn who those women are, tell their stories better. Like it becomes this like feed forward cycle all of a sudden when you give women that space, when their story is not secondary to the men's storyline. And so I lost my mind at Unbound because I was like, yeah, they got their own start. And I like texted Heather Jackson and I was like, dude, like, how cool is that? And she was like, oh, like night and day difference. Like
So
the women's
cool.
race wasn't impacted at all by the men's race. And obviously cycling is different than running, in which like drafting isn't really a thing in trail and ultra running. But that being said, when Katie Scheid or Courtney Dauwalter or someone going off the front can get away, that elastic's broken, right? It's like, while you don't have drafting, elastic and tactics and getting to race head to head is a thing that the women in trail and ultra running aren't often afforded. And it's really fun to pass a bunch of dudes in the final 20 miles of 100. I love it. I love when some guy goes blazing past me and I'll be like, I'll be seeing you later. So excited about this. It brings me joy. But at the highest end of the sport, at the biggest pinnacle races, with the advent of live streams, which does bring in sponsorship dollars, which does in turn mean that the CEOs of companies who are setting the marketing budgets for those marketing directors, all of a sudden they're willing to allocate more money to trail running. And then that money gets allocated to the athletes. Like it's this feed forward system. And so we've actually talked about it. I pitched the radical idea of starting the women's race at UTMB 2 hours earlier, which is a lot. And there's like some logistics in there that would be an issue. I even pitched that you could start all the women 2 hours earlier because they only make up 10% of the field. So it's like 250 people, maybe. Like it's like not that many runners. And like there'd be plenty of time for them to spread out. The men passing them wouldn't be a big deal, et cetera, and so on. It would give the women who are worried about cutoffs 2 extra hours to finish the race. Also really cool if we think that the women oftentimes at the like particularly across the field are about 10% slower, gives them a little bit of extra time. That's a boon. But it also means that all of a sudden you could have Katie Scheid and Jim Walmsley duking it out to finish first.
It's cool.
That
would be
the next day. And allow for the separation of the media teams to cover those races in entirety, right? As opposed to like trying to get an e-biker back up the pass to make sure that we get the first woman coming down onto the Swiss side of the course. Those like logistical things, like you can do a better job just allocating the resources well, but a separate start and like a radically separate start would allow for like cleaner capturing of the entirety of the race and the women's race not being impacted by it becoming a time trial because you don't know where you are in the field. Like I saw a ton of women at about the 30K mark this year, just past the 30K mark. I got to go out onto the course and cheer them through to Notre Dame de la Gorge, which is just like a giant party in the woods. I got to see them there, and I can tell you, they had no idea what place they were in. They didn't know if they were in third or in 30th. Like they had no idea. And you're heading into the night and you don't know where you're going, basically. Like, where you're going on the course, but you don't know where you're going as far as like, where are you in this field versus the front of the men's pack is the front of the men's pack. They know exactly where they are in the race. They know that they are sitting in the lead pack of 6 and they need to keep their head down. The women's race is like almost always a time trial. And so what happened at Unbound was you gave the women a protected race. And what happened is that you had a bunch sprint between 7 women, which is like way more entertaining, way more interesting, and also allows you to tell a very clean media story in which you don't miss the attacks, you don't miss the passes, you don't miss the story because you can actually tell where the women are the entirety of the race. So that's my soapbox. That's my TED Talk. Thank you so much for coming. But I do think that we are working on small steps towards things like that. And it doesn't need to be every race. But I do think at the biggest races in the world, it could be something to play with in a really interesting way, particularly when the fields are thousands of people deep versus a race like Western States where it's 300-ish people.
I think also when you see it become successful one time, using Unbound as the example, this obviously worked. It was a better experience for the racers. It was a better experience for the media. It was a better experience for the spectators. Well, then we should just do this all the time. And so then it perpetuates. When you start creating these best practices, races around the world start adopting those same formats and start kind of building that in, and that just raises all the boats.
Could you imagine if you like had a mountain bike World Cup, like a cross country mountain bike World Cup, where they let 250 riders all start at the same time, men and women?
No,
like the start loop would be awful,
mayhem.
Right?
Yep.
It'd be mayhem. Yeah. It'd be confusing. It wouldn't work. And so it's like, why do we expect that to work at these other races? So Golden Trail this year, actually, for the first time, really started to separate the starts. They either had the races on separate days or they had the races start, 30 minutes apart type of thing. Some of those went better than others. I think the 30-minute early start for the women and this like 2.5 hour length race ended up being the most successful because the spectators were all still out there. I think when you go to separate days, like you see at like the mountain bike World Cups, for example, you got to be careful that you're not making one of the fields feel like they're the afterthought because they're on the like less important day of the race weekend. So I think like playing with that's also very important.
Mountain biking is a tricky one sometimes too. For example, this year or last year was the first year that women rode at Red Bull Rampage, and they rode 2 days before the men rode. And part of the reason, probably the majority of the reason for that, is that there is a specific wind window where after 11 a.m., the wind picks up and the course is essentially unrideable. It's too gusty. You don't want to be hitting, you don't want to be
Those
backflipping
huge jumps.
like
Yeah.
a 60-foot drop with a gust of wind up to 11 miles an hour or whatever. And so it had to be done on separate days to make sure that everybody had prime conditions to ride. But I think the benefit of that, and especially because Rampage is sort of an evergreen thing that lives on outside of the live window in a meaningful way, is that everybody got their chance to shine, and it wasn't everybody getting packed into a really small window. They really had a chance to let the women's event breathe for a day or two and then put the men on, which I think worked really well in that specific scenario.
Yeah, and that's such a unique event too, where like you got dig teams out there. They're basically just like camped out in the desert for a while. Like the media's camped out there type of thing. So it's not so much this like most of it is like lives on after the live event itself, right? Like obviously it's live streamed. Um, but most of it isn't like this massive, massive spectator event versus something that might be going on in public, like UTMB or like a more prototypical like cross country or downhill World
Yeah.
Cup.
What I think is really interesting about Rampage specifically is that almost every competitor had a camera crew of their own with them creating YouTube content for their channels. So if I had a prediction for 2025 and beyond, I think actually you were talking about getting more women into running specifically, and I think you're spot on there. I think one of the things that's going to help that is the communities that kind of get built up around the content. And so Rampage, the women did a great job there capturing and sharing their experience and then kind of getting something afterward to be able to tell their own story, their own experience, and really show the behind the scenes of the whole thing. I think that the next phase for all athletes is that they're going to at some level have to develop their chops as a content creator.
Yep.
And if I can editorialize a little bit here, I think that this is my opinion. I think that female athletes have had to do a lot of extra stuff to really make it work. You had to not only be a racer, but you also had to coach. Where maybe someone at comparable to you on the men's side was just racing essentially. I don't know ultra that well, but I've got to imagine that you may have had to cobble together more things than your counterpart.
Yeah, I mean, women are set up uniquely, I think, too, for the influencer space in the sense that women have always had to be more than just good at their sport
Hmm.
in order to make a
Exactly.
living.
Yep.
They've had to be pretty and they've had to like or funny or like, been able to pitch a product. I think they are uniquely equipped. Actually, Matt Trappy, I think, wrote about this in Matter of Brand recently in his newsletter, talking specifically about how women are well versed in like potentially making a bigger leap when it comes to like if run influencing is going to be kind of where a bunch of those dollars go to, that women are kind of maybe better set up for that. I think we actually saw this in the parody research as well as the I think they're called the Collective. They're a Weisserman like research subgroup that specifically works on women's athletics. Um, that women are also like fans of women's sports are more likely to actually spend money on the products that female athletes are marketing or talking about and or are sponsored by. And so not only have they had to be really good at the marketing angle or the creating additional stuff angle, fans generally spend more and rely more or trust in more female athletes
Interesting.
over male influencers, over male athletes, which I think is super interesting.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
The I think that pairs with the point that I think I was headed towards of like you've been multitasking this entire time, and so picking up content creation as one of those tasks will be easier than someone who's been lulled into the idea that they could just be an athlete. One of the most interesting moments that I think I had at Red Bull when I was one of the athlete managers, my first ever meeting with Austria, the head of athlete marketing, got in front of everybody and said that female athletes have the highest ROI. I thought that was really interesting because I looked at the roster that I had, and when I was at Red Bull, I actually had about 50-50 in
Mm-hmm.
terms of men and women. And every single one of them, every single woman that I managed was a world champion.
Yeah.
You had to be a world champion basically to get onto this roster, or at least when I started. But also that was the bar, which is crazy. And yeah, I think now there's more opportunities opening up in a pretty meaningful way, and there's more stuff to do. But when he said ROI, I was like, oh, that's cool. But then the more I thought about it, I'm like, but they've had to do a lot of extra stuff just to get here.
Yeah.
No wonder their ROI is high. They're already world champions. They're already creating content. They're already doing all this stuff. Like, they've been hustling for a long time. That's why they got on this roster in the first place. So it originally came off as like, oh, that's cool. And then the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I don't
Like, oh,
know.
maybe that's a problem, actually.
Yeah.
No, but right, it's a blessing and a curse where it's like we see this, and this is why, I think like talking about like trying to get more women into trail and ultra running is so interesting is that when you talk about like applying for jobs, right? Like, we know from the data that like men are more likely to apply for jobs that they are underqualified for. If the job says like need to be familiar with Microsoft Office, the men are like, yeah, I've like downloaded Excel. And the women are like, I have a master's degree in Excel spreadsheets. And it's like, and I don't know if I'm qualified for it. And it's like, the men are like, yeah, I've downloaded Excel. Like, I can figure this out. So I think that like we see that though. And part of that is like, well, there hasn't been funding for women, or society tells us that we should be doing something else. What have you. I mean, it's why the women's peloton in road cycling is like full of like former Wall Street finance execs and PhDs in mathematics, and people who have other jobs because they like can't afford to just get paid by being given a $6,000 bike. Like, that's not, you're not going to pay your mortgage or your grad school loans or whatever with a $6,000 bike. So like they've had to hustle, I think, for decades. But at the same time, it's also like there are like societal underpinnings to a lot of that too, where we like really have to be sure that we can do something in order to put ourselves in that position. So it's like blessing and a curse. Part of it is societal. Part of it is like this world not being set up for women. It's run by men. It's dictated by men. It's funded by men. And yet we see that, it turns out women are really good for business.
Yeah. If you had a chance to make any immediate impact, I mean, yes, increased participation would be amazing, but what are the things that you want to see happen? Maybe not a prediction, but like if you could wave the magic wand and like make it be so in 2025, what are the things that people should be thinking about? I mean, there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast that are movers and shakers, but also motivated to make stuff happen. What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, I heard or read or saw something. It's like, what am I consuming? An interesting stat recently, and it had to do with just like physical activity in the US. And I'm pretty sure it's North American based. I'm pretty sure it's a US demographic. I don't think it was global. But on average, women are only getting about 33% of the like recommended weekly physical activity in comparison to their like age matched men. We're getting closer to 43 or 45%. And so it's like one of the things I think is like convincing women. And it's like, if I had a magic wand, right? And I'm like queen for the day and I get to do whatever I want, would be like to magically convince women of any age group that they're like, that they are an athlete, that they like, that moving their body is one, worth their time, is a benefit to them, etc. Because part of it is like, you can say, well, do women want to do that? And it's like, well, they probably do, but they just don't have time to do it. But also we know, again, I keep saying we know from the research that one of the greatest predictors of being active as an adult is actually like high school athletics. What countries have high school athletics? Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia, parts of Japan, and that's kind of it. Parts of the UK. Otherwise, it's all club athletics and it's not affiliated with school. And so it's like is an extra thing that someone would have to go out of their way to do. versus it being part of like a high school experience. And so what that means though is that we've got to convince a wide swath of the population that they are in fact athletes, that they can choose to allocate time to moving their bodies. And I think that if I could like had a magic wand and got to change things, because this has like bigger implications than like my bottom line, it has implications for like health and wellness and prosperity, but would be to like convince adults, particularly adult women, that they are in fact athletes, and that that can look a lot of different ways, and that they can like take that time, or should be able to take that time to actually get outside and move,
That's cool.
or
I
ride a trainer, or a stair mill, or whatever makes you happy, but like actually have that time in your day.
Yeah. I think about that a lot of the entry point consumer, because I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people who are pro athletes that want to get into content creation are trying to show this aspirational, like this is what it's like to compete on the highest level. But are there enough people that are doing the entry point stuff to welcome people into some of these sports, and do they exist? There was an interesting chat actually in the Slack channel for Second Nature recently about, are there women doing shoe reviews for running shoes? Does that exist? And there were a couple examples which I'm going to put in the show notes, but
Mm-hmm.
not on the level of some of the other, there's a lot of men doing shoe reviews on the internet too. So who's talking to the entry point consumer? Who's welcoming people into this next phase? And I think content creation, it's this is my thing though, where like when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But I
Yeah,
do think
if
that
you're like
content
YouTube
creation,
for
yeah,
everyone.
like it would make it would reach a lot of people, because what are most people doing when they're not active? Looking at Instagram, looking at YouTube, staring at the internet. So let's put something motivational there, and try to fish where the fish are, I guess.
Yeah, I love it. I'm not even an elder millennial. I decided actually recently that I'm calling my generation of millennials degens. We're just degenerates. Like, people are like, "What do you do for work?" And it's like, "We can't explain it. Don't worry." And they're like, "You're skiing on a Wednesday." And you're like, "Don't worry about it. It's fine." So we're the degen. But I like just recently feel like I've discovered YouTube, in the sense that like they're like, I was messaging a friend, her and her husband have a YouTube series that they started this year, and I was like, "Excuse me, I'm waiting for my next episode to drop. Like, what am I supposed to do when I have to run on the treadmill for 15 minutes? Like, I need you to give me the next 15-minute video so that I can run on the treadmill." um but I do think that, yeah, it's obviously, it's like one of the, it's, what is it now, like officially the world's biggest search engine.
I think it's number one, number two. I mean, it's up there for sure. And that's it. A lot of people are visual learners
Mm-hmm.
too. And so a text based search engine is probably not the move, but video based, that's it.
Yeah. So I think that, yeah, the that entry level point is really important. And I've talked a lot about this kind of in the context of running, where it's like we have to work both above the funnel and below that funnel point, where it's like, yeah, it can seem really silly to like give one person an entry into a race. But if that person is like, and they don't need to be an influencer, they don't need to be, wildly famous, they can be like a very normal person. But if they are a person who is actively engaged in their community, and they are a woman, or they are a woman from a minority group, right? And they are actively engaged in their run community at home, them doing that event has way bigger impact than like paying one influencer. And
Yeah.
so it's like trying to figure out ways to actually bridge that gap, to make it approachable, to make the sport not as scary, and like you provide mentorship and education all of a sudden
Yeah.
by like just giving one person an opportunity to go and experience this thing, and then to bring that information back to their wider community.
Just to move off this topic a little bit, but I want to also bring it back to you a little bit, because you just announced recently that you ended a 6-year run, pardon the pun, but you ended, and now you're kind of moving into this next new phase. You don't have to drop any mega exclusives, and I'll bleep out if I accidentally said anything that I shouldn't have, but
No, you're
What's
good.
what does the future of Corinne look like? We've gone through the past, we're talking about the present, but what is the future?
Yeah, I was joking with a friend earlier this year where I became a legacy athlete without winning anything. Like, I've like run some good races, and I've gotten to perform at the highest level. injury definitely stymied some of that, but it was one of those things where it's like I've become a legacy athlete without having to like have one Western States or UTMB, which is very interesting. It's like a very interesting position to be in the sense that like I have a lot of value as an athlete and a person, which, you know, I can tell myself that too, but I have a lot of value as an athlete and a person, that isn't just about like, well, are you going to podium at Western States this year? And so I was in this interesting position where my contract was coming to a close, at Adidas Terex. I was offered, and I can say this, I was offered a new contract there, a very safe 3-year option, like, you know, wasn't getting put out to pasture by any means. They were actually like finding creative ways to like lean into some of the media work I was doing, et cetera. Like they were wanting to work with me, and it's a team that I love and respect, and all that jazz. But I was like, I felt that it was going to be kind of a stagnant option when I like think about I'm 34, I like love everything I do, but I'm like very much have been spending a lot of time over the last like year and a half thinking about like what does come next for me. Like poor Topher Gaylord has listened to me like opine about like should I go and do an MBA so many times. Like he has humored me over and over again talking about like career options for me. Like do I go back to school? Like do I like am I a person who has like a lot of soft skills but not a lot of hard skills? And if I want to move into the sports industry, like do I need to do that? Do I need to go to school? Um and I got an opportunity via a bunch of the work that I've been doing to essentially learn hard skills, by moving into a sports marketing kind of contractor role that will have some like cross functional aspects to it, working on things that I've already been working on. So, working on women's trail running specifically, doing research, which is something I love, putting into, because it's like you can't work on barriers if you think the barriers that you're working on aren't the ones that actually matter. So, doing a bunch of research, laying the foundation to actually try to make an impact, in a way that allows me to build into a role. So, I have an athlete contract, and I have a really cool sports marketing contract that is going to keep me very busy. It's contracted as part time, but we all joked that like many weeks are going to be very more than part time. Um, and but it allowed me to kind of evolve, and it's one of those things where it's like that can become a full time position. Um, that can be something that can be invested in further. And it feels like it was a position very much like created to kind of give me this next step, by people who believe that I can do it, which is really, really cool. And I feel very fortunate that I was given that opportunity, particularly at a brand that has not been my title sponsor for the last 6 years, because that would be a more natural progression where you got brought into a team that you've been working with closely. So it feels crazy to like turn down a 3-year contract for something that's like feels very much more uncertain. But I am like very like it's like the gut knows what the gut knows, and was very much the right move. So we'll know more. Like more will definitely be official by the time that like early February rolls around. But we're kind of like waiting for all of the ink to dry, so to speak, right now.
That's really cool. I mean, you've developed some serious institutional knowledge that will be valuable to that brand and any brand that you really work with that shouldn't be lost by going and getting an MBA and going off into a different direction. You know, there's some stuff that you've learned, seen, experienced that I feel like needs to stick around that will improve the lives of future athletes, of future brands, and the industry at large. What you know, you've worked with a handful of brands, and you've got a new one on the way that you're going to be working with. What is the advice that you would give to brands? Because I think this is really smart, right? Like we have someone who can represent us as an athlete, but they can be really useful to us on the sports marketing front. What advice would you give people who work at brands, like how to treat their athletes or how to think about working with their athletes outside of just send them a box of product and hope for the best?
It's super interesting because I feel like so strongly both ways about this as an athlete as a person who has a lot of friends who work in this industry too. Like again, I feel like one of my attributes is that I like kind of know everyone somehow. And can kind of if you need to get to someone, I probably know how to get there. Like I probably have a point of entry, a contact. Um, which is just like a super bizarre, did not expect this 10 years ago. Um, And so I do hear like I've definitely heard lots of athletes complain about different brand managers across our sport and across many other sports, um, and they are oftentimes thankless, like thankless jobs, um, because they're like they haven't figured out how to sign this contract yet, and I'm like, that they've like probably been like fighting tooth and nail with like their boss and their boss's boss to make sure that like the running team has a budget. And it's like it might feel like they're dragging their feet on signing this contract, but like they're probably like it's very possible that they are like trying to figure out how to not to have to like cut everyone. So it's like pump the brakes a little bit, like give them some like space. There was a brand that the team manager kind of like who reported to the head of global marketing left, and they hired three people to replace that one person.
Oh my.
Like those people are overworked. Like a lot of these people in these roles are very overworked, and the backfill of positions is slow and tedious, and headcount is always an issue at every single company, along with like being at the whims of the higher ups. And so, but at the same time, like communication and like some degree of like not hand holding, but like I would say high touch is probably important, even if it doesn't like that can feel really hard from an activation energy standpoint of like I need to talk to all these people. But it's like the quick like, hey, like I know you were hoping to have this thing done this week or to have this thing at your house this week, but like we are working on it. Like I just wanted to keep you in the loop that like it's moving along like it should, but it's taking longer than expected due to X, Y, and Z. So it can be a text, it can be a quick email, because I think that I've experienced this as an athlete too, like early in my career, where it was like, this company doesn't care about me. This sucks. And then I would like talk to my brand manager for like 30 minutes and I'd be like, oh, no, life is good. Like, this is amazing. I love this person. So it's like akin to coaching, actually. I coach a bunch of people, not too many, hopefully just the right amount. But they like, I am their one coach versus like I coach, generally like 25 to 35 people. So it's like, I am one person to them, but I have 35 of them that I have to like have touch points with. And so it's the same thing of like managing athletes as a team, as like a team manager, as a brand manager. Same thing goes for coaching, where it's like it actually just like a little check-in being like, hey, like I am so sorry, like I saw this text when I woke up, shouldn't have read it at 6 a.m. Like I'm getting back to you now. Just like having those moments of like a little check-in here, a little check-in there goes a long way. It doesn't always have to be this big conversation, like getting on the phone, this big email. It can be like a, hey, I saw this, I want you to know that I saw it, and like I'm gonna get back to you on Monday. And I think that would alleviate a lot of stress for a lot of athletes, both athletes that are being coached and athletes that are being managed.
I couldn't agree more. I think as an athlete, no one's in a bigger hurry than you. And a lot of times people at the brands don't necessarily understand that, or they think that the cadence that they are communicating with is the right cadence, which
Mm-hmm.
it's never enough. And that's the hardest part. When I was managing athletes at Red Bull, like making sure that I stayed in contact with, you're right, that many people at the same time. I'm trying to maintain contact here, but I'm also fighting like 50 battles on the inside to make sure that I can keep delivering for those, 20 athletes or whatever. It's a juggling act for anybody who manages athletes in any capacity to keep both sides of the table happy.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting. I tell every athlete that I'm going to like work with as a coach, like, hey, like I'm pretty good at this, but like I can't read minds. It's like the one skill that I have not mastered. Like I am not a mind reader. So like if you need to talk to me, I need you to tell me that. Like if you need me, I need you just to send me that text, send me that email. Like we'll make it happen. If that becomes a phone call, like we'll make it happen. But it's like honestly, there's probably like a tact to that a little bit as like someone who manages humans, be it as a product manager or as a senior manager at a company or an athlete manager working with athletes for a brand. It's like maybe that's the tact where it's like, hey, like I just want you to let you know that like I'm working really hard for you. Like you are part of my like cohort of people that I am like working on. We have these one-on-ones that will happen as they happen, but like I can't read minds. So like there's no secret messaging here. There's no reading between the lines. Like if you need something, I need you to self-advocate. Like I taught high school for a while, as just like another thing that I did while I had six jobs.
Yeah, why
Um,
not?
and the ability for quote unquote modern day teenagers to self advocate in this like at the school I was teaching in was really phenomenal, and I loved that that was the standard. Like you're a 10th grader, you need to self advocate. Like you need to tell me what you need because like I don't know what you need. And it's like, oh, like we could do this with adults too. Like have adults self advocate. And so I think that that's maybe like a tact that we should push forward as people managing people.
I like that. That's a good tactical piece of advice. Well, that was one of the other things I wanted to ask you because I think there's a lot of athletes that are just getting into the sport or just kind of trying to find their footing when it comes to really any sport. And you've kind of gone through a lot of different phases as an athlete. What is some of the advice other than, advocating for yourself? What's some of the other advice that you typically give people that are coming to you just trying to figure it out?
Yeah, it's been interesting. And I feel like I'm not completely out of line to say that like sponsorship is great, but it's not everything. And I get to say that from like a position of privilege of having been a sponsored athlete or like having a sponsorship. Um, but I see athletes struggle oftentimes because what they're really seeking is like validation. And a sponsorship is going to validate them. It's going to validate their efforts. It's going to validate their self worth. It's going to tell them that they're doing the right thing. But that's the thing is like it's not what it should be doing. That's not what like you should be getting out of it. It's like, do you need like gear support? Would travel support make a big difference for you? Like would racing within this brand's ecosystem, because they're going to have races they want you to go to that might not be the races that you want to do, is that worth the $20,000 that you're going to get annually? Like is that an appropriate trade-off for you? Are you happy doing those races for that additional income? Because it's not going to be enough to live off of unless you're like 21 and single and like have a Tacoma. Um, but I think it's like that can feel really controversial to be like is sponsorship what you're actually seeking type of thing. Because it definitely makes parts of the sport much easier. But I've got friends who like have great jobs and like are just like are seeking something besides maybe that gear support. They like the validation is the important piece of the puzzle. And I'm like, do you want to be trapped for essentially an ambassadorship? And it's like trying to actually get down to like what you're getting out of it as an athlete, and like is it worth it? Like is that trade-off appropriate for you? And if it is, awesome, like great, like sign the document, like this is something that you can do. But if it's not, like it's something to actually like I think step back and take time to actually evaluate.
That's what we needed. So Corinne, we usually end the podcast with a segment called BPC, which is brand product content, and it's just one thing that we want to send people off into the weekend with of something that we found interesting or that's we're really excited about. You're the guest, so we'll roll out the red carpet for you.
Oh
What
yeah, that's how that
what you got?
works. You're like you're
Yeah,
the guest, so I'll listen to you go first.
you go first. I'm
um
happy to go first if you want.
um No, I mean, I think this is really hilarious. As I mentioned, I was like, I think I've just discovered YouTube. Like, this is great. Um, but I do think that's something that I've like been engaging with more recently is like really evaluating the athlete's role in being responsible for their own brand and being responsible for developing that content, because it's a big ask, right? Like, I thought I was getting paid to run, and now you're telling me that like really I'm getting paid to like put out 8.5 minute YouTube videos every week, so that we can like monetize and hit the right like mid ad roll. But I do think there's something to be said for like really leaning into becoming a brand, becoming your own brand. Ali Ostrander was on the Trail Network, different than Trail Society, Trail Network podcast with Hillary Yang and Katie Asmuth recently, and she's an amazing example of this as a person who has spent a lot of time becoming a brand effectively. She ran for Normal for the last 2 years. Her and Normal parted ways this past year because really what she wants to do is run on the road and run on the track and maybe do a little bit of trail. Signed with Oiselle, a Seattle-based apparel company, so shoes, she can do whatever she wants. And they're interested in her as an athlete, but they're also very interested in her as a content creator. And so I thought it was really cool that she was like, yeah, I took the pressure off myself from like the running side, and I really leaned into like content creation. She has an agent for brand deals for content creation, but she does her own negotiations for running. And I just think that's really a very interesting take from an individual who's enjoying getting to like pursue running at the highest level. She went to the Olympic trials on the track this past year, finished seventh in the steeplechase, like has a lot of potential. Is like 28, has another Olympic cycle in her for sure. So it's like just cool to see this athlete like who enjoys content creation, really like lean into that and like be like, I'm taking the pressure off the like needing to make bonuses with this brand from a running standpoint, and I'm gonna like put the time and energy into like creating meaningful content and like having brands that buy into the content piece of what I'm doing.
You're talking to the right guy on this one because you know I'm a complete nerd for YouTube, but also
Yeah.
just really taking the pressure off the athlete themselves where they don't need to rely on contest results all the time. And contest results can absolutely amplify what you're building. So you have other ways to get people to come to the channel, but then you also have this ability, this lever that you can use, but also the brands that you partner with can use that lever to tell their story in a more meaningful way. I mean, you think about the difference between YouTube and Instagram. On Instagram, if you're lucky, somebody watches your piece of content for 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
It's not enough time to really like do anything other than flash some cool thing on the screen. If somebody's sitting for 8.5 minutes watching you explain anything, that's a different level of engagement, and that means something. And even if the view count is lower, there's just more there for the brand to value and for you to build off of when it comes to building a community and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so
I think
she puts out basically like I think it's approximately weekly, and I think she had her best year ever just from like YouTube monetization this year. She did like a good like how much money did I make at YouTube, like make as a YouTube content creator from YouTube, like so not counting like brand deals that are like helping to subsidize this to fund it. She made like $37,000 just from YouTube monetization. So it's like that's pretty awesome between like long form content and shorts. Like
yeah.
was able to make like that's a public school teacher in most states. Like that's a full-time job.
Or a sponsor. I mean, that fills the spot of a major sponsor as well, where you don't have to. I mean, that's the other side of sponsorship that doesn't get talked about. If you have 8 sponsors or even less, those are 8 people that you need to talk to all the time at best. Maybe there's 2 people at that brand you got to stay in communications with, and it only gets harder and harder the more sponsors you get. So if you could replace that with running your own content, not only does it make it more valuable to the existing sponsors, but maybe that's one less sponsor that you have to really work hard to, meet the deliverables for or stay in communications with. That may actually take a lot of pressure off of you or change the pressure. I mean, it's not nothing to put out a weekly video on YouTube, that's for sure. But you're doing something that's so easily trackable. And I think that's one of the things that's the most difficult when it comes to being in those board meetings, trying to find the budget for the sports marketing program. And you're kind of just, you're trying to sell the vibe basically of athletes. It's a lot harder to do that than, here's 15 million views for this athlete that we got. Like what conversation would you rather be leading, when you
Yeah,
get into a
totally.
meeting like that?
Like yes, they won this race, but they also do this on YouTube, and they get 7,000 downloads an episode for their podcast, and they get like yeah, those pieces are it's not work, obviously. And you probably want to like it, but it has a huge upside.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just gets more interesting as things go. Okay. Well, related to that, my BPC is Zero Draft. This is a newsletter that I am obsessed with. And funny story, Patrick Crawford, who's the guy that runs Zero Draft, was on a call with me the other day, and we were connecting because he used to run Inkwell. Now, Inkwell was this agency that ran social for guys like Jimmy Chin, Travis Rice, all these outdoor icons. And then they did a bunch of other content development and social work beyond that. But Patrick and I were kind of comparing notes. And then I realized, like halfway through the conversation, that he writes one of my favorite newsletters. And this newsletter is a lot. It's really focused in on exactly that, athletes and content. And he just goes really deep on this stuff that I really care about. And I think he's got a good idea of where everything is headed. I'd previously linked an article that he wrote called Millions of Views, Zero Podiums, but he's got all kinds of other articles in there that are definitely worth checking out. So Zero Draft, Patrick Crawford.
Cool.
This guy's a legend in the space of content creation, as far as I'm concerned. And we've got a lot of really amazing Substackers that we recommend and stuff. But this one, yeah, this is worth checking out.
I mean, I love it. I think it's one of those things where it's like, you want to write a book at some point? Like, you better get a newsletter going, because how are you going to get a one of those advances, right? It's like, yeah, I've got this many eyes tuning in every week to like watch this thing, to read this thing, to listen to this thing. Like, those are numbers that speak to other brands when it comes to further and future negotiations.
This is like my number one piece of advice for people is to demonstrate your expertise on the internet. And it doesn't just mean, I mean, LinkedIn posts are great and you are getting out in front of probably the right people. But I do think that putting out newsletters like this, building a community, building an email list, and just really putting your editorial spin on stuff and putting it out for the world to read, I just think there's something really interesting there. And it's good practice too, of just being consistent, sharing your point of view, really showing people what you think of stuff, how you work, how your brain works, and what might that lead to. Like we said earlier, maybe not something immediately, but the second or third permutation of what comes from that might be really interesting. The indirects of all this stuff is fascinating. I mean, second nature is a great example. There hasn't been anything that's immediately linked to this where we're automatically monetizing, but the conversations that have come out of people that we've met through second nature, all time, amazing opportunities. And so much has come through just the connections we've made from just showing up and making content.
All the gears are turning. I love it so much.
Oh man. Corinne, thank you so much for joining me on the pod this week. I'm so excited that we finally got to talk to each other. I'm assuming that hopefully this is the year that we actually get to meet in real life, but this is a good start, I think.
I heard you're coming to TrailCon, right?
I think I owe it to Dylan to be there.
Yeah,
So
I think you're contractually obligated at this point.
it's on my calendar already, so it's blocked out. I will almost certainly be there.
Sweet.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, and yeah, we'll see you at TrailCon.
Sounds good.